We are back at it today with another, one of our standard episodes, just me, and we're just going to be talking about grids, talking about using grids in your UI and your web design and how you can use that to kind of make things a little bit easier, especially for folks that aren't super familiar with design or don't have a big design skill set of their own. Anyway, I'm trying to think if there's any kind of housekeeping news. We just had our R2 release. So if you missed any of our live streams or our webinars, all of that stuff has been recorded. I'm pretty sure you can check it all out on the Kendo UI YouTube page. Definitely worth giving it a look. And if anyone will be in and around at some conferences, I will be at DevUp in St. Louis in just over a week, I think. So early June, I believe that's the 6th to the 8th. So if you're there, come say hi. And then I will be at React Next in Tel Aviv at the end of June, the 28th. So anybody who's out and about doing conferences would love to say hello, meet some folks in person. All of that being said, let's dig into what we're here to talk about today. So again, we've been a little bit on and off. We've had some guests. I've been in and out doing conferences. But in general, the goal of Dev by Design is to take different design basics, fundamentals, and really break them down and look at how you can apply them. Sorry, I get distracted by fuel. Tough choice, Layla or Kathryn. Oh, she's streaming now too. You can go watch her. My feelings won't be hurt. It's okay. But we're here to take different pieces of design fundamentals, break them down, let you guys know how you can implement them in your UI design to kind of level up your design game a bit. We have been talking about grids recently. We did just kind of a basic introduction last time and kind of looked at some of the ways grids have been used in web design on and off kind of since the beginning of the web. You might go insane and start spouting nonsense. You know what? Me too, honestly. I'm still working my way through my coffee. It's kind of a slow, gross morning. I'm looking out my window and it's stormy and disgusting. So I'm trying really hard to be focused and to be a present adult doing her job. But honestly, it's a toss-up today. No promises. But that's actually one of the things that I like a lot about streaming is we can just kind of get on and chat. And that's all I'm going to do today. We're just going to do a little bit of chatting about grids, how they work, what they are, different types of grids. That's what we're going to focus on today. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the idea of a grid at all, grids are a really great tool, especially for devs who are learning to design. Because a lot of times you kind of look at a blank sheet of paper or a totally new artboard in Figma or whatever, and it's like, oh my God, where do I even start? It just feels really overwhelming. You get that fresh journal kind of panic where it's like, I have to put something good on this page and I don't even know how to begin doing that. But grids can offer you a kind of system, right? They're a way to lay out your page, whether that is a physical page or a page on the internet. And they offer you kind of like a guide, right? So that when you are laying things out, it looks consistent, it looks organized, it makes sense, and it helps the user's eye move through all of the different elements on your page. This makes a ton of sense for web design, especially because CSS and HTML are very naturally grid-based, right? Just the way that they work, the way that you structure things on the page, the way that you use divs as layout tools, now especially with things like CSS Grid, it's become super, super easy. But by nature, we're just putting things in boxes, right? That's the whole thing. that is web design, is you're just putting mostly box-shaped elements on a page and pushing them around. And that aligns really perfectly with the way that grids look and work. So even if you're not super well-versed in tools like CSS Grid, if you have already gotten used to the web design way of thinking about things, right? Thinking about divs as structural elements and putting things inside divs and structuring the way that your divs scale, then you're already basically halfway to using a grid. done. Yeah, right. The other thing that I think is like a really common misconception with grids is this feeling that you're just kind of stuck, like they're very limiting. But really, a good grid should be kind of inherently flexible. It's meant to be kind of like an underpinning of your layout system, but it should never feel prescriptive, and you should never feel like you are stuck, right? Like one of the things that's kind of interesting and can be difficult as a beginner is the idea that like you are the designer. You always have permission to break the grid. When I think part of kind of mastering this is the idea of knowing when it's beneficial to break the grid and when it's distracting to break the grid, right? So if you always want to kind of play it safe, you can stick to the grid and let it be very prescriptive and let it really dictate your layout. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like that will get you a pretty decent design. No shame in that. But when you're looking for something that can really push that design to the next level, being able to break individual rules, and this is not even specific to the grid, I think this is true of design in general, knowing when you can break specific rules and have that be interesting and surprising and delighting and not confusing and overwhelming, that's a real skill. And we've talked about that a little bit on here before, I think mostly in the context of like animation. But I think that is probably a tenet that is true across all of design, is that once you know the rules, you know how to break them in ways that are effective and interesting. So keeping in mind that breaking it all the time means you will lose that sense of unity, and you'll kind of also lose a bit of the power and the punch that comes with breaking it. I think there is something to be said for occasionally breaking free of the grid. And just before we dive in really far, I recommended this book before. I will recommend it again. If you are looking for a deeper dive, this guy, Making and Breaking the Grid by Timothy Samara, incredible book, 10 out of 10. Like, and I'll level with you, it's not new. This was a classic basically already. I'm looking for like a published date in this to see if I can find it. 02. So yeah, this was already effectively a classic when I was in college, and that was a while ago. But it's really, really good. Some of the sections specifically about the web and about web design, like the visuals look a little bit outdated, but the basics have remained incredibly true. So I've referenced that a couple times as we talk through like definitions and high level stuff, but I'm confident, right? If it came out in 02, you can probably Amazon a copy for like nothing now, like $10. What? I don't know. Probably nothing. So I highly recommend picking that up. That being said, let me get my screen share going because I want to look at a little bit of an example. Sorry, should have had this probably set up, but I didn't. So give me just a minute. In the meantime, shout off in the comments. How are y'all? Good morning. Hello. Hope your day is going great. I saw a handful of folks joined once I had already gotten through my little beginning spiel. So if you're hanging out, drop a hello. Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. All right. Here we go. So we're going to look at some parts of the grid, right? Because I think the first thing that you need to know in order to effectively use a grid is all of the bits and pieces that make up a grid, right? And it seems relatively intuitive. Like a lot of them are the same as a table, right? Which makes sense, right? Because we use data tables as effectively makeshift grids for a long time at the very beginning of web design. I'm glad we don't have to do that anymore because that kind of sucked. But you'll see a lot of similarities there, right? The first of which being obviously columns. Columns are the vertical alignment of the elements on your page. You can create as many or as few columns as you prefer in your grid. The construction of the grid is always up to you, right? So some people prefer a grid that has lots of really small columns that allows them to use all sorts of elements of varying width and still kind of have this larger unifying structure. Other times, like fewer wider columns, or maybe just one big column will suit your layout better. And we'll talk a little bit once we've got through all the things that make up a grid. We'll talk about some different standard types of grids. And you'll see there is one called a manuscript grid that is just one big column. So again, just to kind of reinforce, grids can be whatever you need them to be. They're just meant to give you a little bit of guidance and a little bit of structure. The important part here is that you are using the same grid across all of the pages in your application or your website so that you get that consistency. And what the actual grid is almost doesn't matter as long as it's flexible enough to contain whatever you need it to actually do. Similarly, you can see here, right? So here's an example of how you might have elements that are wide enough to span multiple columns, but they're all still aligned to the same grid. You can see the next part of this, obviously, would be rows, right? Rows are just the horizontal alignments of your elements. You probably guessed that. Again, tables, you're used to rows and columns. They work pretty much identically to the way that columns do, but they're sideways, not vertical. Sometimes you will see these called flow lines. That is kind of an older term, and it has to do with the way that your eyes flow through the page, right? So you can kind of see here the way that we start to break this down, and the way there's a little bit of flow even to this fake grid with fake elements. How high our rows are, how wide they are, all of that has to do with how we draw the user's attention, how we move through the page. We've talked a little bit about some of that stuff before, mostly when we talked about Gestalt theory and the way that our brains naturally want to group and make sense of information, right? So just a quick, super quick recap on that, in case you had not seen it. The TLDR basically is that our brains want to make associations between elements because that gives us a kind of faster, quicker way of processing all of the huge amounts of input that we get every single day. It's kind of the same way that we make assumptions or stereotypes almost. We're just looking for ways to put things into boxes that make sense because that helps us process the world. There's so much happening all the time. And visual design is exactly the same way, right? So when things are close to each other, we assume there's an association. When they're further away, we assume there's not. And the way that things are grouped and the positioning that we have can really influence the way that a user understands the page. So that's super high level. There's a lot more nitty gritty in how you can make and break those associations. But, but that's a good kind of overview. But I highly encourage you to go back and check that out. I'm curious. Fuel, do you mean that you're writing code, you're using tables to lay out your page? Because I'll level with you, that concerns me vaguely. Table format your source code. I'm gonna need more information on that. I need to hear more about that. Please drop that into the chat. All right. The next thing to take a look at that is part of the grid is modules, right? So basically, any modules are each kind of box, each square that is created by the intersection of your rows and columns. Modules are really any empty space, any block of empty space where you can put content, which will, by extension, turn your kind of rows and column structure into actual rows or columns of information. So you can see here in this example, this is a column-based grid. It's got basically 6 modules, right? So 1, 2, 3 kind of skinny ones along the top in the header, then 1, 2, 3 where the text is meant to go. We'll talk a little bit more about these around the sides. That would be a margin that would not actually be considered a module itself. Sorry, I bumped a button over on my screen and moved my notes, and now I'm like, where'd they go? Scattered. Okay, here we go. Got my life back together. Next is spatial zones. So Spatial zones are any combination of modules that are used together to place a single element. So you can see here we've got more of a block grid type structure, right? So in this one, there's a bunch of smaller, equally sized boxes, and the elements on the page are aligned with these boxes, meant to span multiple boxes. So this, along the top, these 5 boxes that make up the header, that would be considered one spatial zone. These over here that contain the image, this is one spatial zone. And then these that contain the text would be another spatial zone. This type of grid is really nice. It's really, really flexible. And you can kind of create these spatial zones however you need. And again, the type of grid that you choose and how many rows and columns you create really just has to do with what you're planning to do with it, and what is most flexible and most interesting to you. Here's a little bit of what I was talking about earlier. So the space that is in between all of your modules, whether those are, blocks like this or back here in the column 1, this space between is called a gap, or sometimes called a gutter. Gutter is a little bit of an older term that often specifically refers to the space in between pages in a book. So, fun thing, when you're laying out for a book, you have to accommodate for the fact that most books don't lay flat, right? So there's page down in here that you don't actually see because it goes all the way to the binding. So you have to accommodate for the fact that when a book is open, there's space here, that effectively disappears visually. So when you're looking at this, you're not looking at 2 pages laid completely flat side by side. You're looking at 2 pages that have this little bit of like a bow to them. Sorry, my dog's going crazy in the background. I don't know if y'all can hear that. He's evidently not a fan of gutters. But in print design, gutters specifically are the place where your pages meet at the binding, and you'll have to accommodate extra space there. Obviously, not so much a thing in web and UI design, but the term has kind of hung around. And so oftentimes you will see these kinds of spaces referred to as gutters, even though there's not necessarily an actual gutter for things to fall into anymore. It is kind of like a gutter ball, like same idea. Oh, and good, referring back to this. Yeah, so to format the code so that it looks table formatted. You have types, like to have types in one table column, variable names in one table. Oh, okay, I get that. That makes more sense. I am relieved you were not talking about CSS layouts. So the last piece of a grid is the margins. And that's this stuff, the space that is actually around the grid itself. So this is a good example because they've marked out their margins in this green, right? And here you can see the gutter along that side. All of that marked out in blue as opposed to the grid itself that is in red. So anytime you're talking about the space that is between the actual content and the edge of the page, or in our case, often the edge of the browser window, the edge of the device screen, whatever, it's important to consider your margins because they do have a really serious effect on the look and feel of your page. Things will feel really, really tight and really uncomfortable if the content runs all the way to the side of the page and that doesn't look or feel intentional. This is especially true of text, right? So often you can get away with like, images or videos or whatever going all the way to the edge of the screen. In fact, for videos, that's often what you want. You want them to like take up as much of the space available as possible. But text is really hard that way. We don't actually want text to do that because it's really hard to read text when it comes all the way to the edge, to the bleed. It makes it harder for us to keep track of where lines begin and end. So offering some margins, giving things some breathing room, a little bit of space, that is really, really helpful to prevent that feeling of like busyness and overwhelm. It's a really common mistake that I see folks make. Again, there's this idea of like, we have this whole page, we need to use the whole page, we need to put as much information on this as humanly possible. And I think that's an instinct that is well worth fighting when you're designing things. Your content is going to be much more effective if it has room to breathe and your viewers have space to kind of look at things and process, and it should never feel like a competition to fit as many things on the page as humanly possible. So margins are there to help you with that. Margins also will contain any of the kind of small pieces of information that need to be placed outside the grid structure. This is often like page numbers if you have some kind of a long document, or footnotes, or any kind of like trailing header and footer that's there all the time. This is maybe a little less common in UI design, but it's certainly not unheard of, right? So things like pagination can exist outside the grid. Footnotes, especially if you have any kind of like blog or article, there's going to need to be some space where you can include those. And yeah, I don't ever want to, I feel like there's always something that's outside of the expectation, like something else that you just need to squeeze in. Good question. What's the difference between a gutter, gap, and a margin around each cell block? So they are in fact very similar in that they are both space around elements, right? But margins are meant to exist around, they kind of shift the content of the page in. So like, let me see if I can find an actual example. Let's go to the Progress website. So we can see here that there are margins, right? There's empty space here and here, right? The image trails off. But when we're looking at the actual content of the website, there's a clear margin that's happening on either side of the actual content. Meanwhile, like this would be considered a gap, right? The space that's here in between these elements. Obviously, this is a really clear example because these are actual like boxes in a grid, but like that would be a gap. This would be a gap, right? We see here, you can already start to kind of see the grid structure once you start looking for it, especially when we zoom way out, right? So like, I wish there was something that would let me like draw on the page. I wonder if there's like a Chrome extension that will let me do that. We'll do a quick Google. If it doesn't work, I'll give it up very quickly, I promise. But yeah, okay. Wait, where'd it go? Get on the page. Is it not installed, right? Where's my brand new? There it is. Okay. Drunk. Excellent. Great. So that was not a very straight line. But these would be margins, right? From here to like here. And a little bit we can see up here. I wish I could draw a straight line, but I can't. This is a margin also, right? Meanwhile, this is the actual grid content. And I would say, again, I'm not gonna be able to do this. Oh, it will let me draw straight lines this way. Oh, most excellent. That rules. Right, so this, I would say, is the grid. I drew this line incorrectly. I wonder if there's an eraser. There's one. Okay. Oh, maybe not. Okay, whatever. Ignore this. This is part of the margin as well. I was just off in my estimation, right? So you can see here, and if I were to draw both lines, right, like you can start to see these would be the gaps. So, and we can start to kind of estimate some rows here too, right? So like here, here again, obviously, here, yeah, et cetera, so on and so forth. I promise I won't do the whole thing because that would take an eternity. But you can start to see the way that the structure is working here. So the difference is going to be what is part of your design. And I think the important part here is that things can span multiple, like you can go over the gaps when you are talking about things that are part of the grid structure itself, right? So again, kind of talking about, we talked about those spatial zones earlier. So I'm gonna change this color maybe not. Oh, here we go. Here we go. So like this would be like one spatial zone, and it includes these modules and these gaps. same here. Like these are more, this would be a spatial zone. This would be a spatial zone. This image that goes off like that, right? Like this guy, this little grid, because these are all linked together. This is one spatial zone. This button. So you can start to kind of chunk the page apart in this way, right? And see the way that we've kind of broken it down. This is one. Okay, I said I wasn't going to do the whole thing, and then I immediately proceeded to do the whole thing. But I hope that was at least vaguely helpful. But yes, to answer that specifically, the difference has to do with whether it is part of the grid structure itself or whether it is around the grid structure. And the main difference there is whether you put content there or not, with only some exceptions like this background image. So this question from Metal Rain, how do you think about which piece of content owns the gap and dictates how large it should be? I would say the main thing to think about here is where you want to draw the eye. Let me see if I can clear the drawings here, right? And like redo this without all of the crap. So right, here's our grid, and we're looking at kind of what's important, right? And the short answer here is that you want the things that are most important to be basically up at the top and to be large. So, clear my stuff again so that we can look at this as it would be 100%. Right, so when we load this page, forgot to do, oh well. When we load this page, then we've got a couple of things here, right? So like here's our grid, basically again, and we want to pull the user's eye to the things that are most important. So we've got a grid. I'm not going to draw all the gaps and stuff. I'm just going to do like a basic column outline here. We want our things that are interesting and important to be big and at the top. So here, that means mostly this headline. So we've created this section that's meant to be eye-catching, and it lives here at the top. We've got this big image that we want to be interesting. Things with eye contact, things that include pictures of other people, those draw us in. You know, we've got this button and the red color that makes it contrasting. Those kinds of things we give precedence to. Okay, like the wide blue element has a smaller gap up to down. Why is that? Does the title below have a bigger gap? So in general, okay, yep, I see what you mean. Mostly what we're looking at here is we're talking about, let me try that again. Ooh, sentences, English, gross. So the grid itself here is the same. What we're seeing here is spacing in and around the elements inside of it, right? So the grid itself would be consistent, and then there's spacing of the elements inside of the grid, if that makes sense. Because we want to group things that are similar, right? So you probably noticed like there's a gap here. And that's because if we pushed this up, it would start to feel like it was part of this unit above it, when in fact, there needs to be a break here because that's not all one thought, you know? And then down here, we kind of have this natural break, right? We're giving things a little bit of breathing room. We're working still within the structure of the grid that contains all of this. But we don't want to run everything together because having that white space and having that break breaks up ideas and concepts. I think we see it more clearly here. You know, can I move this thing? No, this is just here forever. Okay, whatever. We see it more clearly here where there is an actual like dividing line, right? We see there is an actual, there's just like an HR tag. And that gives kind of a more visual and clear separation of ideas. But the same concept applies really anywhere where there's a large amount of space like that. We're separating ideas and concepts and breaking the page down into bits and pieces that make it easier for the user to digest. So hopefully that helped. Definitely, if folks keep throwing questions in the chat. I think this was helpful. Or throw me a website and we'll grid it out now that I have these fancy drawing tools. That could be fun. Otherwise, I'm going to jump back over here and we're going to start talking a little bit about common types of grids. So there are 4 main types of grids. I don't know if you can hear it. It is storming over here. I'm talking like rain, sheeting down, thunder. If you lose me, it might just be because I lost power and therefore internet. But like, whoa, it is a second coming out there. Dang. So anyway, grids. There are different types of grids. There are 4 main different types of grids. First is the Manuscript Grid. Actually, we're just going to pull open this website because it's really good. We're going to go from credit where credit is due. I really like the way these guys broke down the different types of grids. So Manuscript grids, these are mainly thought about in terms of like, again, laying out a book, right? So you can see there's a one big grid space here in the center, and that's for you to just throw in text. You get a little bit of margin, a little bit more at the bottom to accommodate, again, those kinds of like page numbers or footnotes or whatever, definitions, asterisks, credits, anything you need hangs out down here. This is one that doesn't get used a bunch in UI design. They do have an example here, and they tend to be these kinds of websites that are like just text. So like you might see that with like magazine style. So let's see, I wonder what like Vogue magazine, because I would bet they would do something like this. Give me like a story. Yeah. So right, like this is a pretty good example of a manuscript grid. They mix it up a little bit. They've got some like images and of course some advertisements in there. But in general, we are just talking one giant thing, right? So grid, margin, margin. They've got their header up here. You can see like this would go like so. And then this is all one content area. So this happens occasionally, but not super, super commonly in website design. More often we see with websites column structure, right? And that makes a little bit more sense. It makes things a little bit more responsive, right? Because we've already kind of chunked our information into smaller columns. I'm trying to think of a website that would naturally have a column layout. Maybe like a newspaper. Maybe like New York Times. Let's see. This is I have no idea if this will actually work or not. Yeah, kinda. Ish, I would say. This is probably more of a like module style. I would guess actually this is more of a modular grid. The New York Times, right? So modular grids are meant to be super, super flexible. This kind of like square based, everything's exactly the same. I would say that's probably here because we can kind of see them align. Although maybe it is columns. I'm undecided. Let's see. Let's try to grid it out. All right, so obviously these guys have a super defined main structure. And then actually, I might go ahead and call this a column one now that I'm actually looking at it because I don't think these align exactly horizontally. I thought it did it first because this one kind of does, but I think that's just luck because this one does not. You can see this intersect here, which means I would say columns, right? So we're seeing columns this way. And those continue all the way down the page. And the content, the layout of each column does not align necessarily exactly with the others. So I'm gonna go ahead and say, I guess correctly, New York Times gets a column layout. But yeah, these are really good because we've already kind of broken up our content, which means that when we resize the page, they flow, they flow very naturally. So we can see them kind of shift here, right? The columns stack. Turn this off. The columns kind of stack automatically because they're already built that way. Just shift and then chunk. It's very nice. So we go from 3 columns down to 2, right? This is one that I think we're probably more familiar with, especially like Bootstrap worked very much in this way. I don't know how many of y'all used that either back in the day or today. But Bootstrap is really, really dependent on the column layout, right? And that was kind of the way that their grid structure worked. So I'm going to see if I can find some examples in their docs, because there used to be like really good visuals back when I was using it. Grid. Yeah, okay. So here you can kind of see the way that they break it down, right? So a container, a row, columns within it, when you're looking at all of that. And the way that they break it down, right? Like all of this is exactly the same as the structure that we just talked about, right? They've got gutters, they've got columns, they've got rows. They definitely have gaps built in, although I'm not sure exactly where they talk about that. Here we go. I was hoping for some examples, right? So like they break this down exclusively in terms of columns. So that's the kind of grid that they're creating. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's predictable. It aligns well with the way HTML and CSS very naturally work. I think it's something that's easy to grasp, right? So like even without a huge amount of design knowledge, you can pretty well see how this works. It doesn't take a lot of specialized knowledge. This makes it a really good option, especially if you are new to design layouts, right? A column grid is never going to do you wrong. Modular grids are really nice, I think, especially for application design, because they give you that kind of flexibility and allow you to work things out however it makes the most sense, right? So like, let's see. If we were looking at doing like a page here that was an application, maybe this is our like header, right? This is still a really wide brush. That's better. Okay. Right. So like you get the header up here, right? And you can kind of imagine like there's probably a logo here. And then like these three are probably one content zone with a menu. And then you can almost kind of imagine like maybe this is a dashboard. That's a really good example, right? Because these things like they're super modular. So maybe you've got like one little card over here, and that's like some kind of a chart or grid. And then you got another one over here, and this is like, you know, text, updates, notifications that you missed. And maybe down here you've got a like super wide one, you know, and this is like people in your team, you know, and then maybe you've got a tall guy down over here. And this is like a bar chart. This is like the most stereotypical dashboard thing. Like this is what happens on like every single component library, like example page is like, look at our dashboard grid with the 25 grids. I've never built a page that includes 25 grids, but it would be cool, right? Yeah, then maybe there's another one over here that like extends down off the page. And this is like, maybe this is like a calendar or something. I don't know. Having too much fun doing this. But you can kind of see how this would break down, right? And that it gives you the flexibility. And if we started this whole thing over, right, like we could assume, maybe this is a second page in the same application. So we leave the header, that stays the same. But then we've got the flexibility within these boxes to do a completely different layout, right? So maybe now we do like a big guy here, and then we've got a sidebar. Sidebar would probably be on the other side, but whatever, that's fine. We've got a sidebar, or like maybe this is like navigation or something. And we've got like, you know, some bigger sections here that have bigger content. We can do this. We can have completely different designs. I could wipe this clean and we could play laying this out 20 more times. And we would still have that consistency page to page because we're basing it on this same kind of structure that repeats itself over and over. And so even though these elements are completely different from the elements that we drew before, it's still going to feel unified in a way that it wouldn't if we were just winging it, like just doing every page completely from scratch with nothing, because we have the consistency of our margins here. This all looks and feels the same, right? We've got usually some repeated elements like our header here that will give us some consistency. And then here we're looking at, we're always going to have like the same width in our gaps and our margins. We're going to have the same kind of spacing. Even if the elements themselves are different, we've created visual consistency that stays with us page to page. And that is really, really huge, right? So like, even, I'm trying to think of like the right way to put this. Sorry, I'm just like, I get on here every morning and I just hope for the best. So I'm glad you're here. But when we start to create that kind of consistency, we start to give our users visual clues of where they can expect things to be, right? And how they can expect things to lay out. So when we look at things that have that kind of pattern, our brains start to make connections, even kind of subconsciously. So even if we're not aware, like we don't ever, at least very rarely, do I load a page and think like, aha, the placement of this element mirrors the placement of that element. Like that's boring. Nobody navigates the web like that. But our brain is doing that in the background. It's making connections between pages that we looked at before. It's making assumptions based on standard types of user interactions. You know, even though, like, let's say when you left click on something, right? You don't know what's going to be in that menu. That often changes. The left click menu, the stuff that happens when you like left click in Google Docs is different than the stuff that stuff that happens when you left click on your desktop is different than, you know, whatever the standard browser one. But you know, generally you will get an option menu when you left click 9 times out of 10, right? And that allows us to start making assumptions about what will happen and what we can expect. And even if we don't know exactly what will be in a left click menu, right? Like, because it'll be different if I'm in an image editing program versus if I'm in a word editing program, I'll get different left click options. But I know when I left click, I'm going to get transformation type options, right? To edit whatever I'm working with. And if you're on a site where that doesn't happen, it's confusing, right? Like if you've ever been somewhere where like left click is disabled, which is a terrible UI pattern, by the way, don't do that. But like some places will disable that so that you can't download images, right? And it's confusing and disruptive, not in like a fun way. It's just like, wait, what? Like it really throws you off your game. Same thing is very true of design, right? So like that is obviously part of design. That's more interaction design than visual design. But visual design is also the same way, where you load a page and you start to think like, here's what I expect to be here. Here's where I think I'll be able to find this. I'm trying to solve this problem, and I assume that when I go to this place, it will have the answer, right? The more we navigate a menu, the more we interact with an application, the more we come back to a website, the stronger those kinds of like reinforcement patterns become, and the more accurate our assumptions become. And we as designers can facilitate that for our users by using something like a grid that helps create real consistency, helps us really mirror that over and over very intentionally without a lot of hard work on our end, because the hard work is already done, right? Like this is already laid out. We only have to do this once. We only have to make the grid once, maybe not even once if we're reusing an existing grid. We only have to make the grid once, and then we get to leverage it over and over and over. So it's incredibly powerful in that way. The last piece, the last type of grid is a hierarchical grid, right? And we've talked a little bit about visual hierarchy on this show before, and we can see some of that here. So like, right, our eyes go here first because it's the biggest and it's where our eyes start to skim the page. For those of you that haven't tuned in before, one of the things that's really nice to know is the way that our eyes break down a page, right? So when for cultures that read left to right, we will start over here, top left. We will skim across the top of a page, diagonally down, and then over here in like a Z pattern, like this. And that's how we kind of skim and break down a page. This happens exactly the same way in right to left languages. It just flips, right? So they'll start here, go this way, skim down across, and then down that way. Still just like a flipped C. But anyway, that has to do with hierarchy a lot, because hierarchy is what attracts our eyes and why. And so you can kind of see here, they followed that. They've put their biggest, most eye-catching element right over here where we start, right? So like the heading is here, this big image is here, because this is where our eyes are going to start the skim, right? And then we head across and we get this kind of like, yeah, you see 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So even if I clear all of this and we look at like where would we start, what's the first thing you would see? It's probably art and design, then maybe this guy. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, maybe 5, 6, right? In that order. And there's lots of things that are that way too, where it's like, trying to think of that like, oh, that's not what I meant. What do you read first? Hobbit or Lord of the Rings? What do you read first? Graphic. There's a good thing where it's like, yeah, these guys, right? Where it breaks down like, you'll read this first, then you'll read this, then this one. This is what hierarchy is, right? It's manipulating the flow that our eyes will make through a page based on size and contrast and all sorts of things that we've talked about before, and I don't want to completely rehash for my folks that have been there. Hierarchical grids are just putting this in a kind of more standardized structure. They're a little bit more free flowing. Obviously, like you can see here, this is much more like interpretive than these guys, right? Which are very, very structured. This guy is kind of like, no, whatever, you know? The important part, like, is that this is just repeated, right? So this is totally fine. We could do this again on another page, you know, if it was like, whatever, instead of the art and design section, maybe it's the like the financial section or the sports section or whatever, and it would follow this exact same grid. It would just have different content in all the same spaces. That's totally fine. You know, there's no shame in that game. This is not one that I necessarily recommend to design newbies, because you have to have the knowledge to build that grid completely from scratch every time, right? And to make something that is unique every single time. And if you're looking to do something that is really specific, you know, and that needs a really free-form, organic, different kind of grid, then like totally go for it. There's a lot of power in this. But if you're new and you're looking to just start something, my recommendation would probably be the modular grid if you're doing a UI design, and the column grid if you're doing a text-based design. So, I have officially rambled for like 50 minutes, but I like to leave the last like 5 or 10 minutes of each show for some questions. I also love it when you jump in with questions in the middle. So like shout out to the folks that did that. But also, before we wrap for today, if you've got any questions about grids or honestly about anything design related, or just chat. I like to leave a little space for that. But yeah, hit me up in the comments if there's anything that is on your mind. Otherwise, this is what I had for today. I hope it was helpful. I feel like grids are one of those things that like get a bad rap as being like very, very confusing or like very, very complicated. And I think that can be reinforced unnecessarily by like, this is a big old book, right? Like all about grids. And so you get this feeling that like they're big and scary and overwhelming. And like, where would you even start and why bother? But really, they're not. They're really not scary. And once you've got that kind of feeling for the basic structure of a grid and what it's meant to do, and you kind of know that you can do something relatively simple with it and will always work within that constraint, that's really it. Ooh, interesting question. Are Japanese, Chinese websites and apps obligated to do left to right, or just stick to short lines? So I will admit that not being Japanese or Chinese, I don't have the definitive answer on this. And of course, rather than up to down, there are some websites. I've seen some Asian language websites that will do up and down text, but that is not generally standard because it doesn't like flow and wrap well. So yeah, like let's see. I was gonna see if this had any kind of like specificity. I'm skimming. Like, yeah. At the moment, expression of ideas on the web is almost always done horizontally. But that seems to be mostly because of just the Western bias that has been thus far in web design and the way that we've built the web. This is actually really interesting. I'm going to share this. I'm going to share this link in the chat because I find it compelling. These guys are basically advocating for more support in browsers for vertical text, which is really cool. And they've got some examples of it here. This is all live text, which is very interesting. So good question. I wish I had a little bit more of the cultural knowledge to be able to answer it correctly. But I have seen vertical layout text occasionally in Japanese websites. I was looking for a visual example and got that instead, which was possibly better. But yeah, so like stuff like this, right? Often like constrained within a specific text box. So there's another example, although clearly an older one. It exists, but I think more often we see horizontal text just because that is the way that we have biased web design. All right. Aligning the height of things is sometimes painful. Does grid help with that, even inside cards? I would say yes. Certainly from a design perspective, but I would also say CSS Grid has been really, really good for doing height-based alignments. So I would suggest that as an option, right? Obviously, CSS Grid is like super complicated and not something that I'm going to be able to teach you in the last 5 minutes of Dev by Design, but it is really cool. And they've got, let me, height. Gosh, I'm trying to think of what the right word for that would be. Equal height, maybe. There we go. Equal height rows. And the answer is yes. Let's see if there's an example. I was hoping I would get like a code pen or something. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Oh, here we go. That's what I wanted. Some examples. So right, you can see here that like this one has more text content than this one, but they have created equal height. So our CSS tools are getting better and better in support for that, frankly. And that's been really, really great. And you see just kind of by nature what CSS Grid is able to do to kind of replicate these styles of grids. Grid by Example is one of my all-time favorite websites. So right, like this kind of basic layout is very clearly like a modular grid, but then they've also got support, right? Like this would be a more column-based grid. You can kind of see the ways in which we now have the tools to replicate these more complex grid systems. And when we've created this kind of CSS grid, right, like if we have this in kind of our base styling and we can just import this like over and over and use it over and over on every page, like that's easy. That's excellent. Yeah. Curved text would also be cool. Yeah, I don't know a way to do that that's not SVGs. I think you got the only answer there. I've only ever seen that done as part of like Canvas type stuff or just literally an SVG. So yeah, this is what he used. Yeah, curved text is weird. It is really cool, and it can have a really like interesting and dramatic, like eye-catching effect, but it's definitely not common. Sorry, I got distracted. Evidently got a little vocal fry going on. I believe it. I also end up with like an incredibly dry, sore throat after talking for an hour. So, say Livy, this is my voice. Can't help it. Yeah. Just reading this makes my head hurt. Me too. Same. This is a lot. That's why I think a lot of the time we end up doing this stuff in like whatever, Figma or Illustrator or wherever, and exporting from there. But that being said, we are hitting just about an hour. Hi, you look like an actual, I can't tell if you're an actual bot or not, but hello. We're hitting just about an hour, so I'm going to wrap things up here on Dev by Design. Thank you for joining us. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was informative. I hope you had fun. And I will see you guys next time. Have a lovely week. Really enjoyed hanging out with y'all.